today I present my study on turbulence transition in the wake of wall-mounted prisms. This study is motivated by the aim to understand and manipulate the wake behind sharp-edged wall-mounted bluff bodies under various flow and geometry conditions. This work finds applications in various flow conditions, such as analyzing the wake of buildings, assessing the aerodynamics of trucks and trailers, or analyzing the cooling efficiency of electronic chip, as well as assessing the effects of surface roughness on the internal surface of pipes and channels. Now, the major research objectives accomplished by this work include: first, to investigate the role of depth ratio on the turbulence transition phenomenon at moderate Reynolds numbers. The term depth ratio I'll come to in a minute. And second, to identify the mechanism of interactions between the leading and shear-layer instability with the prism surface that leads to this transition. Now, the wake of wall-mounted sharp-edged bluff bodies features a lot of different vortices, such as free-end vortices from this surface called the tip vortex, junction vortices from here called the base vortex, this horseshoe vortex looping around the bottom surface. The intermingling of all of these different vortex structures behind the prism basically leads to formation of different wake topologies, such as arc-like or Carmen-like wake topology. Now, all of these different wakes and vortices, they are affected by both the flow, that is the Reynolds number or change in boundary layer thickness, or the geometry. Now, two main geometrical parameters in terms of prism that affect these wake structures are: first, the aspect ratio, the non-dimensional height of the prism, and depth ratio, the non-dimensional length of the prism. Now, past literature has mainly focused on the aspect ratio effects, and it has been well established, while the effects of the depth ratio is a research question that I want to answer. Now, looking at different studies on the depth ratio effects in the recent times, we find that at low Reynolds numbers, typically under 1,000, the depth ratio enhances the downwash flow, which leads to suppression of the wake irregularity. In other words, which would say that increasing the depth ratio at low Reynolds numbers suppresses the wake and leads to a steady wake. At high Reynolds numbers, above 1,000, the onset of an irregular unsteady wake behind a long prism occurs because of the destabilization of that leading edge laminar separation bubble. Here is, so this is what that wake model looks like. Now, further, at this moderate range of Reynolds numbers, both aspect ratio and Reynolds numbers enhance the upwash flow, which basically promote a lot of wake irregularity. Finally, this kind of gets us to an important question, that at this moderate range of Reynolds numbers, to enhance the wake irregularity, one can tweak the geometry by increasing the aspect ratio or the depth ratio, or basically tweak the flow by increasing the Reynolds number. Further, this range of Reynolds numbers is associated with the turbulence transition, which is why it becomes important to characterize the wake of prisms in this Reynolds number range. But we focus on a different question, which is that if abrupt changes in geometry can influence the wake irregularity, can then it be linked to the transition to turbulence phenomenon? And that would be the focus of this talk. So to answer that research question, we have performed large-eddy simulations in OpenFOAM using piezo-based solution algorithm and second-order accurate numerical schemes. The parameter space we considered were a range of aspect ratios, depth ratios, and Reynolds number in this moderate Reynolds number range. Here I've shown an example of what the domain looks like with a long prism placed on the ground. This turned off. Right. So, looking at the qualitative vortex structures behind two prisms, a prism with depth ratio of 1, basically a cube, and second prism with depth ratio of 4, a rectangularoid at Reynolds number of 2500. Oops. Oh, it's fine, I wanted to use that. Yeah. So I'm comparing the qualitative weights behind a short depth ratio prism, a depth ratio of 1 prism, a cube, and a long prism, depth ratio of 4 at a Gauss number of 2500. And I find something interesting. So for both of these cases, following the leading edge separation, the shear layer undergoes distinct stages of growth and primary instability formation, which triggers the generation of these Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities. I don't want to do that. So it triggers the formation of these Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities here. Can't see those, but yeah. Further, we see that increasing the depth ratio from 1 to 4, there is a lot of enhancement in this wake irregularity for the long prism, while for the short prism, that leading edge shear layer sheds directly into the wake and it suppresses a lot of activity. Now, here we basically observe that increasing the depth ratio enhances the overall wake irregularity, which kind of defines the role of depth ratio in enhancing these unsteady wake features. Next, we start looking at the mean flow features, specifically the turbulence kinetic energy for both of these cases, and find that initially the shear layer is almost laminar, which makes sense because not a lot of fluctuations in that part would mean not a lot of turbulence kinetic energy generation. Further downstream, following that abrupt separation, the instabilities associated with the leading edge shear layer amplify the fluctuations, initiating that transition to turbulence phenomenon. The regions of these intense fluctuations would result in a higher turbulence intensity, which would maximize the turbulence kinetic energy. Thus, the location of that maximum turbulence kinetic energy would tell us where these amplifications and transitions would occur. In case of the short prism, since the shear layer sheds directly into the wake, it occurs into the wake. In case of the long prism, though, it occurs close to the leading edge, close to the surfaces of the prism. Further, in building towards the mechanism of transition, I start by first looking at the motion of the unsteady shear layer. Now, based on the study by Moore and others, an abruptly separated shear layer features oscillatory motion due to the flow compression and expansion, which is termed as an unsteady shear layer resembling a flapping-like motion. Following the study of Obako, we plot the wall pressure gradients for both cases at the prism center line and find that for the small prism, the shear layer across the length of the prism is steady, while in case of the long prism, it features prominent flow, compression, and expansion, specifically in this mid-span. Furthermore, an unsteady shear layer would induce an oscillatory primary and secondary recirculation, which are seen here for the long prism by these pincer-like structures for the primary recirculation, as well as the secondary recirculation featuring a oscillatory motion. This would tell us that, yes, the shear layer for this long prism is unsteady. Further, we look at the overall flow periodicity for both of these cases. So we probe a point near the leading edge for both of these cases, and we find this prominent signatures of Kelvin-Helmholtz instability. We also find the signatures of its harmonic, as well as the signatures of one Kármán shedding frequency for both cases. Now, increasing the depth ratio from 1 to 4, we only find a meager increase in the Kármán-like vortex shedding, while a significant increase in the frequency related to Kelvin-Helmholtz instability. This tells us that depth ratio increases the frequency of that instability, which would then explain that strong span-wise vortex shedding, that irregular wake that we saw in the animation earlier. Now, in assessing the interactions between the Kelvin-Helmholtz instability and the large-scale vortex shedding, I look at the Poisson's equation. So, when simplified in terms of fluctuating pressure and velocity, the Poisson's equation results in these two terms, which together are considered the primary source of pressure fluctuations in the flow. These two terms are the turbulence mean shear interaction, shown in green there, and the turbulence interaction term shown in blue here. The turbulence mean shear interaction accounts for rapid changes in the mean flow due to the fluctuating fields, while the turbulent interactions are associated with the nonlinear interactions of turbulent structures with each other. So in the next few slides, I'll be looking at these two terms individually. starting with the turbulence mean shear interaction. So initially we note a heightened turbulence mean shear interaction at the location where the abrupt shear layer separation occurs for both cases. Further downstream, the vorticity associated with the shear layer alter the mean flow in that region that basically results in an enhanced flow momentum transport for both of these cases here. In case of the long prism, we quantify it using the trends of the turbulence mean shear interaction. We find a sudden increase in turbulence mean shear interaction close to the leading edge. While for the short prism, we find an opposite trend. The turbulence mean interaction following that leading edge separation reduces and then increases back towards the wake where most of this activity happens. Now, the turbulence mean interactions point towards the mean flow modulation by this leading edge shear layer instabilities, which in case of the long prism, it happens close to the leading edge, close to the location where the motion of that unsteady shear layer was most prominent that we saw earlier. Further, unlike the turbulence mean interaction, the turbulence interaction term is more distributed throughout the wake. Now, this distribution is likely because of the enhanced flow momentum transport, the velocity fluctuations produced by the mean flow alterations gradually affecting the surrounding flow fields. Again, the location of the maximum turbulence interactions, they coincide with the regions associated with the breakdown of the instability into the rollers. So in case of the short prism, occurs into the wake. In case of the long prism, it occurs close to the surface of the prism. Specifically for the long prism, the maximum turbulence interaction occurs at the location of the reattachment of that laminar separation bubble and its subsequent separation from the surface of the prism. So, bringing together that overall mechanism, it is as follows. The influx of energy from the leading edge basically modulates the mean flow in this region, shown here by the turbulence mean interaction. This energy then leads to a lot of interactions, the turbulent type interactions downstream, which would generate a lot of turbulence intensity and fluctuations. With these processes result in a lot of mixing, which leads to an increased momentum transport for that case. Now, these processes then further enhance interactions, mixing and intermingling, which results in a highly irregular, unsteady transitional wake in case of the long prism. Now we know that this mechanism is driven by the geometry, since it remains absent in case of the short prism, where the wake sheds directly into the wake. Further, we look at the interactions from the point of view of bi-spectral mode decomposition. So, according to Dr. Schmidt, the triadic interactions form the basis of energy transfer mechanism in the wake transition phenomenon. So, we specifically focus on the interactions between the mean flow with the instability and the interactions of the instability with the large-scale vortex shedding structures. So we specifically look at the interaction map for those two triads, and we find correspondence with the Poisson's results from earlier. So in case of the interactions between the mean flow and the instability, we find the location where that energy is getting pumped into the flow, where that mean flow modulation is happening. While in case of the interactions between the instability and large-scale vortex shedding, we see the location of where the breakdown happens. Further, these results are actually consistent over the board, over the broad parameter space that we considered, shown here using the case of a short prism and a long prism at a higher aspect ratio and a higher Reynolds number in this moderate Reynolds number range. In conclusion, we analyzed the role of depth ratio on the turbulence transition phenomenon at moderate Reynolds numbers, and identified the novel mechanism of interaction which basically result in this transition as a function of depth ratio. The future work in this case are two ongoing studies which look at the mechanism of the onset of instabilities under the influence of geometry and the update to the near wake model proposed by Zergar in 2022. With that, thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Well, any questions from the audience? Please.
Thank you for the talk. So I have a question about the LES model. Which model did you use?
Dynamics Mandarin scheme.
And have you compared other models before you come to that conclusion?
Qualitative LES, and yeah, we have studies comparing other models. This is a model I've worked with since a long time, so like that, we didn't really have it yet.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Please.
Have you looked at the effect of boundary layer on your study? Have you measured the boundary of the same of your cases?
So not in this specific study, but that is a ongoing work. So tweaking the boundary layer is basically tweaking the flow that would get us a few different effects. That is an interesting study that we would look at, but not in this specific line of investigation case.
Well, then let's thank to your speaker one more time.
Thank you.